All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murock's Android Programming, 2nd edition by Joel Murock for the AWD1112 or 1112 Java Programming class. And we're up to Chapter 15 of 18 on how to work with content providers. In Android, a content provider allows multiple apps to share the same data. Android uses built-in content providers to make certain types of data available to multiple apps. For example, your contact app. All right, that's included or has a content provider, so that built-in Android apps like phone dialers and text messaging apps, etc., can share that. In this chapter, we learn how to add a content provider to the task list app that we've been working on in the previous 2 chapters. This will make the data in the task list of a database available to all apps. We'll also learn how to create a task history app that uses this content provider. In addition, we'll talk a little bit about Android's built-in content provider for contacts. So, as an introduction to this, we have 3 applied and 3 knowledge objectives. Our applied objectives: given a SQLite database, create and register a content provider for said database. Given adequate documentation, use a custom or built-in content provider to read from or write to a content provider. Build and show a dialog box. Those are our 3 applied objectives. For our knowledge objectives, give an example of a content provider typically included with Android. Describe the purpose of a content provider. Describe how a URI for a content provider can specify an entire table or row within a table. Those are our 3 knowledge objectives. So some of the built-in content providers that Android has are shown on the slide here and in figure 15-1 on page 469. Remember, a content provider allows multiple apps to share the same data. That data can be stored in a database or in files. Android uses built-in content providers to make certain types of data available to all apps. Now, the first thing that's shown here on this slide, which is also in figure 15.1 on page 469, is the syntax for a URI. A URI is a Uniform Resource Indicator for a content provider. A URI is kind of a superset of a URL. So a URL is a type of URI. The syntax begins, as you can see there, with content : / followed by the name of the provider, also known as the authority, followed by the path to the content. Typically, a path begins with a name that corresponds with a table or a file, and a path can also include an optional ID that points to an individual row in a table. When you work with URIs, realize that each front slash in the path begins what's called a new segment. When you create a URI for a content provider, you need to specify what's known as the MIME type. That's an internet standard for defining types of content. You can see here where we talk about MIME types for a URI. The first syntax shows how you can return multiple. All right, so it's got the dir in front of it. The second one shows how you can just return 1 row. Back in chapter 13, we learned how to create the database class named TaskListDB, which included methods like getTask and insertTask that the app used to work with a database. This figure shows some methods that you can add to the database class that can be used by the content provider class. These supporting methods provide basic query, insert, update, and delete operations for the task table. They open connections to the database, but they don't close them because the database connections are closed automatically when the process that hosts the content provider is destroyed. So, how do you create a content provider? Well, figure 15-3 on page 472 and 473 shows how this is done. To begin with, you declare a class like the task list provider class that's shown here. The first four statements declare constants for the class, as you can see in here. The first one declares a constant for the authority that's used within the URI, and the next three declare constants used to determine whether the URI matches one of the URIs supported by the class. Next, two instance variables are declared. The first is a task list DB object that's going to be used for working with a task list database, and the second one is what's called a URI matcher object for checking whether a URI matches one of the supported URIs. The onCreate method has code that initializes these variables. And as you can see in the book, at least on page 473, the URI matcher creates a new URI matcher object and specifies the code to return when no matching URI is found, and the add URI method adds a URI to the URI matcher object and specifies the code to return when a URI is found for this, when a matching URI is found for this URI. All right. Well, what about querying? Figure 15.4 that's in your book on pages 474 and 475 show how to code methods for a content provider that provides for querying. To start, you override the query method of the content provider class. This method accepts 5 parameters: the URL, an array of column names, a where statement or clause, an array of arguments for the where clause, and an order by clause. Within the query method, this code uses a switch to check the particular URI argument. If the URI argument doesn't match the URI that corresponds with the all tasks URI, the code throws an exception, which is what you see right here. This exception sends an error message to the developers of all other apps that might be trying to use this particular content provider to let them know there's a problem. Figure 15.5 on pages 476 and 477 show how to code the method of a content provider for inserting rows. To do that, you override the insert method of the content provider class. The method accepts 2 arguments, the URI and a convert values object that contains the column names. Within the insert method, the code uses a switch statement to check the URI, and this works similar to what we just described. So to allow other apps to insert rows into the database, you can override the insert method of the content provider class. Some of the methods, a method of the context class is getContentResolver, which returns a content resolver object for the app. For the content resolver class, the method is notifyChange, which notifies registered observers that a row has been updated. And for the URI.builder class, there's buildUpon, which creates a URI.builder object for building a new URI object. AppendPath, which encodes the specified argument and appends it to the path, and build, which returns a URI object for the current URI. As far as updating, which is shown next on pages 478 and 479, you will override the update method and you use a switch statement very similarly to what we just looked at, all right, for the insert statement. And then finally, for the delete, it's very similar again to what we just looked at. All right, so how do you register a content provider? After you create the class for a content provider, you need to register the provider as described in figure 15.7 on pages 480 and 481. The easiest way to do this is to add a provider element to the project's Android manifest.xml file as shown right here. When you code a provider element, you can code it at the same level as an activity element. The provider element should use the name attribute to specify the name of the class for the provider, and should use the authorities attribute to specify the authority of the provider. You can see they're both shown here. In addition, it should use the exported attribute to specify whether other apps can use this or not. If set to true, that's what it means. So the name attribute specifies the package and name of the content provider class. The authorities attribute specifies the authority for the content provider, and the exported attribute specifies whether the content provider can be used by other apps. Remember that before other apps can use the content provider class, you must register it by adding a provider element to the Android manifest file. So let's see, 3. I think we'll continue on here because the next part at least seems like it would make sense to talk about this. All right, because it's how to use a content provider. So we just talked about how to register. So how do you use it? Figure 15.8 on pages 482 and 483 show how to use the content provider for the task list app. To begin with, the first code example that's shown here defines the constants that the code needs to refer to the names and the indexes. All right. The second example defines the contents for the authority and the URI for multiple tasks. Once you're done defining these constants, you can use the getContentResolver method to get a content resolver object. The next examples call the query method and pass the URI for all tasks as the first argument. Okay? So you can define constants for the columns and the URI for the content provider. You can call any methods of the content provider from the content resolver object. Now, as opposed to using a custom content provider, figure 15.9 on pages 484 and 485 show the code that you can use to work with the contacts provider that comes with Android. In other words, a built-in content provider. It makes it possible for you to work with your address book, to share names, phone numbers, etc. Since this is part of the Android API, you can import the classes that contain the constants for working with this provider. Once you've imported these classes, you can use the constants available from them to work with a provider, and there are examples of that shown here. Of course, as always, to learn more about a content provider that's included with Android, read the documentation for the associated provider. All right, the last thing I'd like to talk about in this part of the video, at least, is on pages 486 and 487 in figure 15.10. So the author says at this point you have all the skills you need to work with a content provider, but we need one more skill, and that is working with a dialog box like what is shown on the screen here. When you create apps, you often need to display a dialog box like this. To do this, you can begin by importing the Alert Dialog Builder class and the dialog interface.onClick listener interface. Then you can use the class and interface to build and show a dialog box. And that's what this is about. So to build a dialog box, you can begin by creating a new alert builder object, which is what you see right here. This supports method chaining, so you don't need to provide a name for this object. Rather, you can just call a series of methods from it. All right, to start, you can call the set message method to set the message that's displayed at the top of the dialog box. In this figure, it's, are you sure you want to delete this class? Then you can set the buttons on the dialog by calling the set positive and set negative buttons. Android displays the positive button on the right and the negative button on the left. In this example, cancel is negative and yes is positive. When you set a button, you can also specify the event that's executed when the user clicks the button. The easiest way to do this is to create an anonymous inner class for the user, and I believe that's shown in here. So again, you can use the alert dialog.builder class in the dialog interface.onClick listener interface to build and display a dialog box that includes event handlers. All right. So before we go back here to the task and look at a task history app, let's stop right here and we will continue on in the next video.